In this video, we'll continue our study of the sublecture that spans Proverbs 27:23 through verse 27 of that same chapter. We're turning our attention now to macrostructural features. The first involves a sense of closure that's achieved by a synonym pattern in sections 1 and 2. What we see here is a double reference to animals, and this recurs, albeit with different animals, both in the poem's first block and in its last block, thereby creating a measure of closure. So if we notice the first block of section 1, we see a reference to animals twice. There's mention of flock and herd in verse 23. If we look down to the last block of section 2, similarly we find reference to animals twice. This time it's not flock and herd, but a different pair, lambs and he-goats. We're looking here at verse 26. Incidentally, the sage extends that list of animals to encompass a third animal in the very next verse, she-goats, verse 27. And thus there is a sense of closure. We begin with a pair of animals and we end with a pair, actually a trio, of animals. The next macrostructural feature involves inclusio by assonance, similar sounds. This occurs then in sections 1 and 2. If we look at the last verse and listen to the line initial expression in Hebrew, it is v'day, v'day. That has the value, the meaning, so sufficient is. That is the meaning of that Hebrew expression in verse 27, right at the beginning. This assonantally recalls the line initial phrase that opened this entire brief sublecture. So in verse 23a, we hear the sounds in Hebrew, yada teda, and this corresponds to what we saw in 27a, v'day. In this way, there is an assonantal inclusio from the beginning of 23 to the beginning of 27. The next macrostructural feature involves inclusio by replacement in sections 1 and 2. The poem begins by urging the farmer to give careful attention to the well-being of animals under his care, in particular flocks and herds. We see that in verse 23. It's instructive to notice that the poem closes by announcing that farmer's success. As it turns out, because of his wise management of his assets, certain animals that are dependent on his care are in fact thriving. But these animals in the last verse are not flocks and herds of his pastures. Instead, these animals by replacement, replacing those livestock animals with another sort, these animals are the members of his own household, human animals, particularly those maidens who rely on him for their basic needs of food and clothing. We see this in verse 27. As the farmer initially cares for literal flocks, he succeeds in caring for a metaphoric flock, one with profoundly greater worth. The last microstructure involves development of thought. First, consider how section 1 leads to section 2. It does so as a principle articulated by an imperative, namely, know thoroughly the face of your flock, and so on. This principle is followed by a strategy that helps the reader actualize that principle. Here's what we mean. The importance of attentive management of one's flock, this constitutes the principle, and that's revealed in section 1. The strategy that the sage next describes of supplying nourishment for the flocks there in section 2, this shows how the principle may actually come to life. Now, within section 2, we find development of thought also taking place. Here, the account of farming further coheres as a cause-effect development of thought. Because the farmer invests labor needed to harvest a rich store of fodder, verse 25, his livestock consequently receive nourishment. And as a result, the farmer obtains clothing, garments woven from the flock's wool. That comes in verse 26. Not only that, but there also is wool enough to sell, and who knows, perhaps fodder enough to sell as well, generating revenue that then funds business expansion. Verse 26b. It's interesting to observe that the exhortation issued here by the sage in this sublecture does not conclude with economic expansion. Instead, the last line, which by its position implies the supreme achievement of this farmer, the last line focuses on those dependent members of a household whose needs the farmer is able to supply through his diligent labors. Verse 27. The poem closes by disclosing that the farmer's young maidens obtain life, which is an achievement far exceeding the mere feeding of flocks and harvesting of wool. In this way, the farm household is able to enjoy life in all its richness. Verse 27b. Now let's turn our attention to microstructural features. The first involves an imperative plus a rationale, which we see in section 1. The first verse of section 1 presents two imperatives that call for attentiveness. Know thoroughly the face of your flock and focus your motives on your herd. These are supported by a rationale in verse 24. So we find the language that's explanatory. For wealth does not last forever, and certainly not a crown from one generation to the next. Our next microstructural feature focuses on that verse that we just read, verse 24, and it appears that we have here a dual theme. The word wealth here in 27:24a and the word crown in verse 24b form a dual theme. Again, it reads as follows: For wealth does not last forever, and certainly not a crown from one generation to the next. We've commented earlier in this series of videos that mention of crown links this sublecture to the theme of monarchy that figures prominently across the entire master lecture, beginning in chapter 25. At this point, the sage cautions that simply achieving a coronation is no guarantee of a long reign. Rather, one must not rest contented, but must work diligently to maintain a durable rule. Parallel to the word crown, then, is the term wealth. In this way, the sage includes non-royalty in this cautionary saying. Given the express interest in courtiers, that is, non-royal individuals, that's been found even in the introductory sublecture, we're referring here to chapter 25, verses 6 through 10, where the sage in that introductory sublecture directs some teaching for courtiers. So given that expressed interest in courtiers, and given the extensive courtier teaching that has just ended, that is, just prior to this third sublecture was the second sublecture, 25:13, all the way through 27:22, that was all addressed to courtiers. So given these two pieces, it seems likely that just like the word crown in 27:24 represents the monarchy, so wealth envisions courtiers. As a result, this combination of wealth plus crown in verse 24 constitutes a dual theme verse. As it functions here, this dual theme operates as a bridge point, linking the two principal audiences, king and courtier, the principal audiences of the entire master lecture. It looks like wealth has been listed first in 27:24, since that will be the adjacent term to the teaching just finished. We've just finished the second sublecture on courtiers. When we come to the bridge statement in 27:24, wealth appears before crown, as if to connect to the most recent body of teaching for the wealthy but non-royal people, that is, the courtiers, in the second sublecture. Crown, then, is mentioned second in 27:24. And as we leave this third sublecture, moving into the fourth with chapter 28, verse 1, here is where we begin to encounter in that fourth sublecture the corresponding teaching dedicated to monarchs. The next microstructure focuses on section 2 and follows the progression of strategy followed by rationale. The first verse of section 2 describes the strategy that the so-called farmer must follow if his engine of wealth generation, that is, his stock in herds and flocks, is to remain truly productive. This is verse 25. It reads, and notice the strategy. Grasses had vanished, yet new growth appeared, and the luscious mountain vegetation was gathered. This is fodder, this is food in the service of the flock. This is the strategy to have a healthy flock. Then in the following two verses, 26 and 27, in these the sage gives a rationale for this strategy, a rationale consisting of benefits that follow the strategy. The farmer receives economic benefit consisting of a wardrobe and resources for expanding his base of productivity. That's typified by him being able to purchase another field, as we see in verse 26. On a more intimate level, he, together with his household and maidens who depend on his care, all of these receive nourishment that brings genuine vitality, verse 27. Our next microstructure is an interesting one. It operates in block 2a, which you see as the single verse, verse 25. It involves a progression from undeserved barrenness to unmerited fruitfulness. Again, a progression from undeserved barrenness to unmerited fruitfulness. Notice the first half of verse 25. Notice in particular that we find here two scenes. The first is described as grasses had vanished, and the second, yet new growth appeared. The first scene is barren. Grasses have vanished from the pasture. In contrast, the second scene is fruitful. New vegetation now has sprung up. The grammar of that second scene in Hebrew indicates that it has appeared, it has unfolded independent of the first scene. The reason we point this out is some might be inclined, if they're familiar with the process of multiple harvests of hay, multiple mowings, they might be inclined to think that the phrase grasses had vanished would be due to the fact that the farmer has come and mowed the first mowing of hay, which then stimulates or at least allows the second growth of hay that can be mowed again. Now, we're pointing out this is not allowed by the Hebrew grammar. If that were the case, if they wanted to say that the vanishing of the grasses stimulates or leads sequentially to, with a sense of causation, leading to new growth appeared, then the Hebrew would have used a form that's known as the vayiktol. It's a consequential form. It says condition B, the secondary one, results as a consequence of what happens first. In this case, the sage does not use that consequential vayiktol, but uses a vikatal form, showing that although a certain condition may, and in fact here does follow the other condition, the other scenario, in sequence of time, The second scene is not caused by the first, but occurs independently. Now, since these two field scenarios stand in striking contrast to each other as to their content, grassless, barrenness, versus verdant, fruitfulness, since they stand in striking contrast to each other, it follows that the overall sentiments of the two phrases, similarly, are standing in opposition. Here's where that leads us. It is in spite of the fact that the pasture has been barren up to this point. In spite of that, it now bursts forth with rich new growth. In spite of the fact that winter has blanketed the pasture with bleakness, nevertheless, spring will reverse that condition. Spring is neither generated nor merited, but appears of its own initiative. So the sage's point is this: current discouraging conditions are not a conclusive indicator of future fruitlessness. Again, current discouraging conditions. If we find ourselves at the beginning of verse 25 in our life experience, we survey our life situation and would assess grasses have vanished. In other words, we're waking up into a barren, fruitless, undeserved barrenness. The sage is saying by this verse, current discouraging conditions are not a conclusive indicator of future fruitlessness. Instead, the farmer needs to display persistent determination. Notice this verse 27-25 is labeled as strategy. This is showing us how the farmer should operate if he wants his flocks to have fruitfulness on an ongoing fashion. Thus, again, the farmer needs to display persistent determination, such as sowing seed for this pasture, even during the last bleak vestiges of winter. The connotation of hardship and even sorrow associated with the sowing phase of farming, and it's sorrowful perhaps due to the fact that the sower, the farmer, has to relinquish, he has to give up seed to the soil, he has to bury it rather than using it for food late in this winter time. This idea of sorrow associated with sowing is evident in another passage, leaving Proverbs and moving to Psalms, Psalm 126, verses 5 and 6. In time, then, cyclical forces that are beyond the farmer's control will graciously overtake current barrenness and will, with the sun's warmth and rain's moisture, yield rich vegetation. This is what we mean by observing that here in block 2a, that is verse 25, the sage is presenting a progression from undeserved barrenness to unmerited fruitfulness. The next microstructure involves a word pair within block 2b. That spans verses 26 and 7. The word pair that we see here is as follows. Mention of he-goats occurs in verse 26, while mention of she-goats appears in verse 27. This has been observed by Waltke in his commentary. This joins those two verses together as a word pair involving that particular type of animal. The last microstructure involves progression of thought in Unit 2b2. 2b2 is chapter 27, verse 27. Here the sage unfolds a three-step progression in the final verse of this sublecture. The splendid outcomes of his diligent, attentive efforts first reward the farmer himself with food. That's in verse 27a. Not only so, but secondly, his household as well is fed, and well fed. Verse 27b. Finally, the sage highlights those who would be most dependent on the farmer's role as provider, those girls within the home who are yet young. Verse 27c. Thus, as a result of the farmer's wise management, these obtain not merely food, but vitality and exuberance, routinely accompanying the sage's use of the rich term, life. Having considered where this sublecture fits in the overall scheme of the master lecture, having considered the macro and micro structures that give it shape and emphases, we are now ready to think about the message which this lecture conveys. The master lecture of Proverbs 25 to 29 consists of counsel for kings and courtiers. In the second sublecture, courtiers must restrain their inclination to self-promotion with its focus on image management. This was introduced in 25 verses 6 and 7. And then the sage reviews that same principle of image management in 27 verses 1 and 2. In place of deceptive image management, the sage advised self-management through awareness of one's own greedy appetites and motives. This may be seen particularly clearly in 27:9 and 19. As valuable as such self-management may be, even this fades before the superior importance of asset management. Once again, the sage is progressing from image management, which he discredits, to self-management, which he affirms, and now moving even farther in importance to asset management. This is the focus of the present third sublecture, chapter 27, verses 23 through 29. Authentic asset management requires a leader to shift attention off of him or herself and to study instead the well-being of others, especially the well-being of those under him or her, those whose labors he depends on in order to generate his wealth, whether that be literal or figurative wealth. The sage makes it plain that such a shift of attention ranks as no minor option, no incidental priority rounding out a leader's crowded to-do list. Rather, routinely to inventory the well-being of his or her subordinates ranks as the foremost of any knowledge that an effective manager can gather. We see this in 27:23a in the phrase, "Know thoroughly the face of your flock." Such knowledge derives neither from antiseptic polls nor hearsay surveys. It derives quite simply from studying compassionately the face of one's flock. Are they weary? Then perhaps we as leaders are driving them too hard. Do they appear gaunt? Then perhaps we've been too lazy to faithfully gather the nourishment they need, like the farmer who harvests from the pasture and then provides it to his flock. Perhaps there we've been too lazy to faithfully gather the nourishment they need, or too selfish generously to disperse it. If you'd like to pursue this principle in terms of the leadership of God's people, please read over Ezekiel chapter 34. Are members of the flock bruised, whether literally or psychologically? Perhaps we are failing to maintain for them a safe environment, free from physical, social, or spiritual hazard. What influences may cause us as leaders to lose sight of the well-being of those who generate for us either wealth or worth? When a leader becomes fixated on output, consumed with the dissatisfaction he or she registers concerning the quality or quantity of what a so-called flock is producing, that dissatisfaction will cause the leader to drive the flock, imposing unreasonable demands in the form of higher production quotas with lower remuneration, be it monetary or otherwise. Earlier The sage discredited this strategy of incessantly longing for more when he described the courtier whose envious eyes devour as insatiably as a hungry Sheol. Notice 25 verses 6 and 7 and 27 verse 20. Countering such bottomless discontent, the sage here assures that so long as this farmer knows and faithfully nourishes his flock, the consequent production of what's referred to here as wool and milk will be, to use his word, sufficient. Chapter 27, verse 27a. Now, this may not instantly rocket the farmer ahead of his competitors. Recall the discredited envy that motivated the self-promoting courtier in 25, 6, and 7. But it will be enough, provided that the farmer is wise enough to realize that clothing enough and food enough and robust vitality enjoyed by those depending on his care, these indices earn him a place among the most magnificent of managers. And we're focusing on 27 verses 26 and 27, the close of this third sublecture. Centuries later, Jesus would draw on the same metaphor of animal husbandry. It served both to describe his own leadership, John chapter 10, Matthew chapter 9, verse 36, and it also served to outline how he charged his disciples to treat those whom he entrusted to their care, John 21, verses 15 to 17, and Acts 20, verse 28. With this, we conclude the third sublecture of the master lecture spanning Proverbs 25 through 29.